The telegram crumpled in Sarah Abbott's gloved hand as the station master turned his back on her, dismissing her with a wave that made her feel smaller than dust on a prairie wind. She stood frozen on the platform of Hill City's train station in the Dakota Territory summer of 1883, watching the man who had just refused to honor her prepaid ticket disappear into his office. And she knew with absolute certainty that her life had just shattered into 1,000 unrepairable pieces. The August heat pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy blanket, making the black morning dress she wore feel even more suffocating. Sweat traced lines down her spine, but she barely noticed. Her father had purchased that ticket 3 weeks ago, before the fever took him, before everything went wrong. The station master claimed he had no record of payment, that the money never arrived, that she was just another desperate woman trying to get somewhere on false promises. Sarah knew he was lying. She had seen her father count out the bills, had watched him seal the envelope addressed to the railroad office, had carried it to the post herself. But none of that mattered now. Dead men could not argue with corrupt officials, and penniless daughters had no voice at all. "Madam, you need to move along." A porter approached her with barely concealed impatience. "Train departs in 10 minutes and you are blocking the platform." Sarah wanted to explain to make him understand, but the words tangled in her throat. Where would she go? Back to the boarding house, where the landlady had already informed her that she had until sunset to vacate the room. Back to the general store where she had tried to find work, only to be told they had no positions for women. Back to the church where the minister's wife had looked at her with something between pity and suspicion, as if being alone and desperate was somehow a moral failing. She moved mechanically toward the edge of the platform, her carpetbag clutched in one hand, the useless telegram in the other. The world seemed to narrow to a point, all sound fading except for the thundering of her own heartbeat. 23 years old, and this was how her story would end, stranded in a town where everyone saw her as an outsider, where her father's death had severed the only connection she had to anything resembling home. "Excuse me, miss." The voice came from behind her, low and rough like stones tumbling in a river. Sarah turned and found herself looking up at a man who seemed carved from the very landscape of the Dakota Territory. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of whiskey catching afternoon light. Dark hair fell to his collar beneath a worn hat, and his shirt and trousers bore the dust of long riding. A gun belt sat low on his hips, but his hands were empty, one holding his hat, which he had removed in a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. "I do not mean to intrude," he said, and despite the roughness of his voice, there was something careful in how he spoke, as if he weighed each word before releasing it. "But I was standing over by the freight office, and I could not help but notice what happened with the station master." Heat flooded Sarah's cheeks, humiliation adding to the summer warmth. "I see. Well, you need not concern yourself with my difficulties, Mr. Jude Norton," he said, "and I am not trying to pry into your business, miss. I just thought," he paused, his jaw working as if he was fighting with himself over what to say next. "Where were you trying to go?" "San Francisco," Sarah said, and even saying the name hurt, because San Francisco meant her aunt's house, meant safety, meant a future that was slipping away like sand through her fingers. "My aunt is expecting me. I have her letter right here, promising me a home, offering to take me in after my father." Her voice broke, and she hated herself for it, for showing weakness in front of this stranger. Jude Norton's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of understanding that made Sarah's chest tighten. He looked down at the hat in his hands, turning it slowly, then back up at her face. "How much is the ticket?" he asked. Sarah blinked. "I beg your pardon." "The ticket to San Francisco. How much does it cost?" "I cannot possibly," Sarah started, but he held up one hand. "I am not offering out of pity," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I am offering because that station master is a cheat and a liar, and I have watched him pull this scheme on 3 other people in the past month. He pockets the money sent ahead, claims it never arrived, and then sells the same seat twice. It is theft, plain and simple, and I am tired of watching it happen." "But you do not know me," Sarah said, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "Why would you help me?" Jude was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on her face. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested old pain, old debts. "Let us just say I know what it is like to be alone in a place where nobody will give you a fair shake, and I have the money to spare." Before Sarah could respond, he had stepped past her, moving toward the ticket window with long, purposeful strides. She hurried after him, her carpetbag bumping against her leg, her mind racing. This was not proper. She should not accept money from a stranger, should not allow a man she did not know to purchase her passage anywhere. But propriety felt like a luxury she could no longer afford, and the alternative was staying in Hill City with nowhere to go and no means to survive. Jude reached the ticket window and rapped his knuckles on the wooden frame. The same station master who had dismissed Sarah appeared, his expression shifting from annoyance to something approaching wariness when he saw who was standing there. "Norton," the station master said, his voice flat. "What do you want?" "1 ticket to San Francisco," Jude said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "On today's train." The station master's eyes flickered past Jude to where Sarah stood. "For her, that is none of your concern. I am paying, you are selling. That is how this works." "Tickets are expensive," the station master said, a slight sneer curling his lip. "Maybe too expensive for a drifting cowboy." Jude reached into his pocket and pulled out a roll of bills that made Sarah's eyes widen. He counted out the exact amount needed and laid it on the counter with a deliberate motion that somehow carried more threat than any words could have. "The ticket," Jude said quietly. The station master stared at him for a long moment, some silent battle of wills playing out between them. And then he turned and began writing out the ticket with sharp, angry movements. When he shoved it across the counter, Jude picked it up, examined it carefully, then turned and walked back to where Sarah stood. He held out the ticket to her, and Sarah stared at it as if it were some magical object, something too precious to touch. "I cannot repay you," she said, her voice breaking again despite her best efforts to control it. "I have no money, no way to—" "I am not asking for repayment," Jude said. He pressed the ticket into her hand, his fingers warm and calloused against hers. "Your journey starts with me, Miss Abbott. But where it goes from here, that is up to you." Sarah looked down at the ticket, then back up at his face, trying to understand what she saw there. He was not looking at her with the pity she had seen in so many other faces, nor with the calculation that made her skin crawl. There was just a quiet certainty in his expression, as if helping her was the most natural thing in the world. "Why?" she asked again, needing to understand. Jude settled his hat back on his head, and for the first time something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Because somebody did the same for me once, a long time ago, and I figured it was time I passed it along." The train whistle blew, a long, mournful sound that echoed off the surrounding hills. Jude glanced toward the locomotive, then back at Sarah. "You should board," he said. "Do not want to miss it after all this." Sarah nodded, unable to find words adequate to what she was feeling. She took a step toward the train, then stopped and turned back. "Thank you," she said, and the words felt completely insufficient for what he had just given her. "Thank you, Mr. Norton." "Jude," he said. "Just Jude." Sarah managed a small smile despite everything. "Thank you, Jude." She turned and walked toward the train, each step feeling surreal. The porter who had dismissed her minutes ago now helped her aboard with exaggerated courtesy, no doubt prompted by having witnessed the exchange at the ticket window. Sarah found a seat by the window and set her carpetbag on the floor, her hands shaking as she smoothed her skirt. Through the window, she could see Jude still standing on the platform watching the train. Their eyes met, and Sarah raised one hand in a small wave, a gesture of gratitude and farewell. He touched the brim of his hat in response, that almost smile appearing again. The train lurched into motion, steam hissing, wheels beginning their rhythmic clatter against the rails. Sarah kept her eyes on Jude as the platform slid past, watching until he became a distant figure, and then disappeared entirely as the train rounded a curve. Only then did she allow herself to breathe, really breathe, for the first time since her father had died. She was leaving Hill City. She was going to San Francisco to her aunt to safety. And it was all because of a stranger with kind eyes and a rough voice who had appeared at exactly the moment when she needed someone most. Sarah leaned her head against the window, exhaustion washing over her now that the immediate crisis had passed. The Dakota landscape rolled by outside, endless grassland dotted with rocky outcroppings, the Black Hills rising in the distance. Somewhere out there, Jude Norton was returning to whatever life he had left, and she would probably never see him again. The thought made her chest ache in a way she did not quite understand. She told herself it was just gratitude, just the natural emotional response to being saved from a desperate situation. But as she closed her eyes and felt the train carry her westward, it was his face she saw, his voice she heard, his unexpected kindness that warmed her more than the August sun ever could. The train rattled through the afternoon and into the evening, making stops at small stations along the way. Sarah watched other passengers board and disembark, listened to conversations she was not part of, and tried not to think about what awaited her in San Francisco. Her aunt's letter had been kind but formal, written by a woman who had not seen Sarah since she was a child. Would they get along? Would her aunt resent having to take in a poor relation? Would Sarah find work, find a way to build some kind of life? She must have dozed eventually, because when she opened her eyes, the landscape outside had changed. They were climbing into rougher country, the train laboring up grades, pine trees replacing grassland. A conductor moved through the car, announcing that they would be stopping in Rapid City for the night, that the train would not continue until morning. Sarah's heart sank. She had not anticipated a layover, had not considered that the journey might require more than one continuous passage. Did her ticket cover a hotel? Did she need to stay at the station? She had exactly $3 to her name, coins that clinked pitifully in the small purse she carried. The train pulled into Rapid City as dusk settled over the town, painting everything in shades of gold and purple. Passengers began gathering their belongings, and Sarah reluctantly did the same, her mind racing through her limited options. Perhaps she could sleep in the station waiting room. It would not be comfortable, but she had endured worse in recent weeks. She stepped down from the train onto the platform, carpetbag in hand, and immediately felt overwhelmed by the bustle around her. Rapid City was larger than Hill City, more prosperous, with brick buildings and busy streets visible beyond the station. People moved with purpose, knowing where they were going, while Sarah stood paralyzed by uncertainty. Miss Abbott. Sarah spun around, her heart jumping, and found herself staring in disbelief. Jude Norton stood a few feet away, his horse tied to a post at the edge of the platform, his expression unreadable in the failing light. "Mr. Norton," Sarah said, unable to keep the shock from her voice. "What are you doing here?" He moved closer, and she could see dust coating his clothes, evidence of hard riding. "The train route goes through some rough country between here and Wyoming," he said. "There have been holdups, bandits targeting passenger trains." "I thought," he paused, seeming to search for words. "I thought you might appreciate some company, at least as far as the next major station." Sarah's mind struggled to process this. "You rode all this way to protect me." "I was heading west anyway," Jude said, but the deflection was obvious. "Figured I might as well follow the rail line." It was a lie, or at least a significant omission, and they both knew it. But Sarah found she could not be angry about it. Instead, she felt something warm unfold in her chest, a sensation she had almost forgotten in the weeks of grief and struggle. "The train does not leave until morning," she said quietly. "I was trying to determine where I might spend the night." Jude's jaw tightened. "You have no accommodations." "I have $3, Sarah said, trying to sound matter-of-fact about it. "I thought perhaps the station waiting room." "No," Jude said, his tone sharp enough to make her blink. He immediately softened. "I mean, that is not necessary. There is a respectable boarding house 2 streets over, run by a widow named Mrs. Henderson. She is honest, charges fair rates, and does not tolerate any nonsense. I will see you settled there." "Mr. Norton, I cannot continue accepting your charity." "It is not charity," he interrupted. "Consider it an investment in my peace of mind. I did not buy you that ticket just to have you spend the night on a hard bench in a train station." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could take care of herself, but the truth was that she was exhausted, hungry, and more grateful than words could express. She nodded slowly, and something in Jude's expression eased. He collected his horse and walked beside her through the darkening streets of Rapid City, leading the animal with easy familiarity. Sarah was intensely aware of his presence, of the way people stepped aside for him, of the quiet confidence he carried. He was not a large man in the sense of being bulky, but there was a solidity to him, a sense that he was someone who could be relied upon in a crisis. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house turned out to be exactly as advertised. A tidy 2-story building with lace curtains in the windows and a small garden in front. The widow herself answered Jude's knock, her weathered face breaking into a smile when she saw who it was. "Jude Norton, as I live and breathe," she said, her voice carrying the faint trace of a Scottish accent. "It has been near 6 months since you darkened my doorway." "Good evening, Mrs. Henderson," Jude said, removing his hat again. "I have a favor to ask. This is Miss Sarah Abbott. She is traveling to San Francisco to join her family, and she needs a safe place to stay tonight before catching the morning train. I was hoping you might have a room available." Mrs. Henderson's sharp eyes moved from Jude to Sarah, assessing her in a way that felt thorough but not unkind. "Traveling alone, are you?" "My father recently passed," Sarah said, lifting her chin slightly. "I am going to live with my aunt." Something in Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "I see. Well, any friend of Jude's is welcome here, though I will warn you that my rates might be steep for a young woman in reduced circumstances." "I will cover the cost," Jude said before Sarah could speak. "One night plus breakfast in the morning." "Mr. Norton," Sarah began, but Mrs. Henderson cut her off with a wave of her hand. "If Jude wants to pay for your room, let him. The good Lord knows men rarely do anything sensible with their money anyway. Might as well let it go toward helping someone in need." She stepped aside and gestured for them to enter. "Come in, both of you. Miss Abbott, you look dead on your feet." The interior of the boarding house was as tidy as the exterior, with polished wood floors and simple but comfortable furniture. Mrs. Henderson led them to a small parlor and instructed them to sit while she prepared a room. Sarah sank onto a settee, suddenly aware of how exhausted she truly was. Jude remained standing, hat in hand, looking like he was trying to determine what to do next. "You should sit," Sarah said quietly. "You have ridden hard all afternoon. You must be tired as well." Jude hesitated, then settled into a chair across from her, setting his hat on his knee. In the lamplight, Sarah could see him more clearly than she had been able to on the train platform. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps 26 or 27, though his face carried the weathering of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. There were scars, small ones, the kind that came from hard work and harder living. But his eyes were clear, and when they met hers, Sarah felt that strange warmth again, that sense of recognition she could not quite explain. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "And please do not tell me it is just because someone once helped you." "This is more than that." Jude was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the hat in his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something Sarah thought might be old pain. "5 years ago, I was in a situation not unlike yours," he said. "My family's ranch had been taken by the bank. My parents were dead from influenza, and I was 21 years old with nothing but a horse and a gun to my name. I ended up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, broke and desperate, and I got into some trouble. Fell in with the wrong people, did things I am not proud of. Nothing truly terrible," he added quickly, seeing her expression change. "But I was heading down a bad road." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "There was this rancher, older man named Daniel Nelson. He caught me trying to steal food from his supply wagon. Should have had me arrested or just shot me himself, which would have been within his rights. Instead, he offered me a job, paid me fair wages, taught me about cattle and horses, treated me like I was worth something. Saved my life, really, though I did not fully understand that until later." "What happened to him?" Sarah asked softly. "He died 2 years ago," Jude said. "Left me his ranch in his will. Turned out he had no children, no close family, and he had grown to think of me as something like a son. I never had the chance to really repay him, to show him what his kindness meant." He looked up at Sarah, and his eyes were bright with unshed emotion. "When I saw you on that platform, saw what that station master was doing to you, I just thought about Daniel. About how one moment of kindness can change everything, and I thought maybe this was my chance to pass along what he gave me." Sarah felt tears prick her own eyes. "That is a beautiful way to honor his memory." Jude shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with the sentiment. "I just do not like seeing people get cheated out of what they are owed, and you reminded me of—" He stopped abruptly. "Of what?" Sarah prompted. "Of someone who deserves better than what life has handed them," he finished quietly, before Sarah could respond. Mrs. Henderson returned, announcing that the room was ready. She led Sarah upstairs to a small but spotlessly clean bedroom with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand with fresh water, and a window that looked out over the garden. "There is bread and cheese on the nightstand if you are hungry," Mrs. Henderson said. "Breakfast is at 7, and Jude has instructed me to make sure you eat a proper meal before getting back on that train." "Thank you," Sarah said, meaning it profoundly. "You have been very kind." Mrs. Henderson patted her arm. "Jude is a good man, one of the best I have known. If he says you are worth helping, then I believe him. Now get some rest. You look like you have been through more than any young woman should have to bear." When Sarah came back downstairs a few minutes later, having washed her face and attempted to tidy her hair, she found Jude waiting in the front hall. He had his hat on again, preparing to leave. "You are not staying here?" Sarah asked, surprised. "I will camp outside town," he said. "My horse needs tending, and I prefer sleeping under the stars anyway. But you paid for a room for me. You should stay somewhere comfortable as well." Jude's mouth quirked in that almost smile again. "I am comfortable wherever I lay my bedroll, Miss Abbott. Do not worry about me." Sarah stepped closer, suddenly desperate to keep him from leaving, though she could not have explained why. "Will I see you in the morning?" "I will be at the station when the train departs," he said. "I meant what I said about seeing you safely to the next major stop. There are some rough characters between here and Wyoming, and I would feel better knowing you made it through without trouble. You are going to follow the train all the way to Wyoming." Sarah could not keep the disbelief from her voice. "It is not that far," Jude said, which was such an obvious understatement that Sarah almost laughed. "Besides, I need to pick up some supplies in Casper anyway. This just gives me a good reason to go now rather than later." He was lying again, making excuses, and they both knew it. But Sarah found she did not want to call him on it, did not want to risk him changing his mind. The idea of continuing her journey alone, of getting back on that train without knowing if she would see him again, made her chest tight with an anxiety she did not quite understand. "Then I will see you in the morning," she said softly. "Sleep well, Miss Abbott." Jude touched his hat brim and turned toward the door. "Sarah," she said impulsively. "Please call me Sarah." He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Sarah," he repeated, and the way he said her name, careful and warm, made her heart do something complicated in her chest. "Sleep well, Sarah." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, and Sarah was left standing in the hallway of a stranger's boarding house, feeling more confused and unsettled than she had felt in weeks. She climbed the stairs to her room, ate the bread and cheese that Mrs. Henderson had left and lay down on the narrow bed, but sleep was elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jude's face, heard his voice saying her name. She thought about what he had told her, about Daniel Nelson and the ranch and the life that had been saved by kindness. She thought about the way Jude had stood up to the station master without hesitation, the way he had spent his own money to help someone he did not know, the way he had ridden hard to catch up to the train just to make sure she was safe. Sarah had known kind people before. Her father had been kind in his quiet way. Some of the neighbors back east had been kind when her mother died, but this was different somehow. Jude's kindness felt personal, felt like it was directed specifically at her rather than just being the general goodwill of a decent person. And that terrified her, because she could not afford to feel anything beyond gratitude. She was traveling to a new life, to San Francisco, to a future that had no room for a cowboy who lived in a territory far from any ocean. Whatever she was feeling, she needed to set it aside and focus on surviving, on reaching her aunt's house, on building stability from the wreckage of the past month. But even as she told herself this, even as she tried to be sensible and practical, Sarah could not stop her mind from drifting back to the moment when Jude had pressed that train ticket into her hand and said those words that had burrowed into her heart like seeds waiting to grow. "Your journey starts with me." Morning came too soon, announced by the sound of roosters crowing and the smell of bacon drifting up from the kitchen below. Sarah dressed in the same black morning dress, wishing she had something else to wear but grateful at least to have clean undergarments and stockings. She braided her hair carefully and pinned it up, trying to look presentable despite having almost no possessions beyond what fit in her small carpet bag. Downstairs, Mrs. Henderson had prepared a breakfast that seemed lavish to Sarah's eyes, scrambled eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits with butter and jam. Two other boarders sat at the table, both men who nodded politely when Sarah entered but otherwise kept to themselves. "Eat up, Mrs. Henderson instructed, setting a cup of coffee in front of Sarah. "Jude was quite specific that I was to make sure you had a proper meal, and I take my instructions seriously." Sarah obeyed, suddenly ravenous once she started eating. The food was simple but delicious, and she found herself cleaning her plate in a way that would have horrified her mother's sense of decorum. But Mrs. Henderson just looked pleased, refilling her coffee cup without being asked. "Jude is a good judge of character," the older woman said conversationally as she puttered around the table. "In all the years I have known him, I have never seen him take an interest in helping someone unless they truly deserved it. He must see something special in you, dear." Sarah felt heat creep into her cheeks. "He is just being kind. He told me about Daniel Nelson, about how someone helped him once." "Oh, he told you about Daniel, did he?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "Now that is interesting. Jude does not usually speak about that time to anyone." "You must have made quite an impression." Before Sarah could figure out how to respond to that, there was a knock at the front door. Mrs. Henderson went to answer it, and Sarah heard Jude's voice in the hall. Her heart began to beat faster, which was ridiculous. This was just a kind stranger helping her reach her destination. Nothing more. But when Jude appeared in the doorway of the dining room, his hat in his hand and his eyes finding hers immediately, Sarah felt that complicated thing happen in her chest again, that warmth and confusion and something dangerously close to hope. "Good morning," he said, his rough voice somehow softer than it had been the day before. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," Sarah said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "And you?" "Well enough." He glanced at Mrs. Henderson. "Thank you for taking care of her." "It was my pleasure," Mrs. Henderson said warmly. "Now you two had better get moving if you want to catch that train. It departs in half an hour, and the station is a 10-minute walk from here." Sarah gathered her carpet bag and thanked Mrs. Henderson profusely, trying to convey in words what the woman's hospitality had meant. Then she and Jude were walking through the early morning streets of Rapid City, his horse trailing behind them on a lead rope. "Did you really sleep outside town?" Sarah asked as they walked. "I did. Found a nice spot by the creek, good grass for my horse." "That does not sound comfortable." Jude glanced at her, amusement flickering in his eyes. "I have been sleeping on the ground since I was 21 years old, Sarah. A patch of grass by a creek is luxury compared to some places I have bedded down." The use of her first name sent a small thrill through her, though she tried to ignore it. "Still, you could have stayed at Mrs. Henderson's. I am sure she would have given you a room. And taken the money that could have gone toward your breakfast." He shook his head. "No, I would rather you ate well and I slept under the stars. It is a fair trade." They reached the station with time to spare, and Sarah felt her anxiety return as she saw the train sitting on the tracks, steam already building. This was it. She would board that train, and Jude would ride alongside for however long he had promised, and then he would turn back to his ranch and his life, and she would continue on to San Francisco alone. The thought of that final parting made her throat tight, which was absurd. She had known this man for less than 24 hours. She had no claim on his time or attention, no right to feel this sense of impending loss. "Sarah," Jude said quietly, and she realized she had been staring at the train without moving. "You all right?" "Yes," she said quickly. "Yes, I am fine. Just gathering my thoughts." He studied her face for a moment, his expression unreadable. "If you are having second thoughts about San Francisco, about your aunt, you do not have to get on that train. There are other options." "What other options?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious what he could possibly mean. Jude hesitated, seeming to war with himself. You could stay in the Dakota Territory, find work in one of the larger towns, build a life here. It is not easy, but it is possible. I have no money, no connections, no skills that anyone seems to value, Sarah said, trying not to sound bitter. Trust me, I explored every option in Hill City before that ticket became my only hope. You could work on my ranch, Jude said abruptly, the words coming out in a rush. I mean, not as a ranch hand, obviously, but I need someone to help with the house, with the cooking and the bookkeeping. I have been trying to manage it all myself, and I am terrible at it. The pay would not be much at first, but it would be honest work, and you would have a safe place to stay. Sarah stared at him, completely blindsided. You are offering me a job on your ranch. I know it is not what you planned, Jude said, and she could hear the uncertainty in his voice now, the fear that he had overstepped. And if you want to go to San Francisco, I completely understand. But I just thought I should offer, in case you wanted another choice. Part of Sarah wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to seize this unexpected lifeline and hold on tight. But another part, the sensible part that had kept her alive through the worst weeks of her life, insisted that she think this through carefully. I would be living on your ranch, she said slowly. A young, unmarried woman living on the property of a young, unmarried man. That would destroy my reputation. There is a foreman's cabin about a quarter-mile from the main house, Jude said quickly. You would have your own space, complete privacy. And I would hire a woman from town to come by regularly as a chaperone, to make sure everything was proper and above reproach. Why? Sarah asked, echoing the question she had asked the day before. Why would you do all this for me? Jude looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands the way he had done at the station in Hill City. When he looked back up, his eyes were clear and honest. Because when I saw you standing on that platform, looking like your whole world had just collapsed, I saw myself 5 years ago. And I thought about how Daniel gave me a chance when nobody else would, how that one act of faith changed my entire life. Maybe I am being selfish, he admitted. Maybe I am doing this as much for me as for you, because it makes me feel like I am honoring Daniel's memory. But the offer is genuine, Sarah. If you want to stay, if you want to try building a life here instead of in California, I will do everything I can to help you. Sarah's mind raced. San Francisco meant her aunt, but it also meant depending on the charity of a woman who barely knew her, trying to find work in a city she had never seen, being forever the poor relation. Here, in the Dakota Territory, she would at least have honest work, independence, a chance to build something of her own, and Jude would be there. That should not have factored into her decision, but she could not pretend it did not matter. The thought of never seeing him again hurt in a way that defied logic. I need to think about it, she said finally. Can you give me until Wyoming? That is where you said you were riding to anyway. I could make my decision by then. Relief washed over Jude's face. Of course. Take all the time you need. The conductor called for boarding, and Sarah realized they had run out of time for this conversation. She clutched her carpetbag and turned toward the train, then stopped and looked back at Jude. Thank you, she said, for the offer, for everything. I know I keep saying that, but I do not know what else to say. You do not need to say anything, Jude replied. Just know that whatever you decide, I will support it. If you want to go to San Francisco, I will see you safely there. And if you want to stay, I will make sure you have a good situation, one where you can be independent and safe. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak further, and boarded the train. She found a seat on the side facing the platform and watched through the window as Jude mounted his horse, settling into the saddle with easy grace. He saw her watching and raised one hand in a small wave. Sarah waved back, pressing her palm against the glass. The train lurched into motion, and true to his word, Jude urged his horse into an easy lope alongside the tracks. For the first hour, Sarah could see him clearly, riding parallel to the train, his attention split between the path ahead and occasional glances at her window. Every time their eyes met, Sarah felt her resolve weaken, felt the pull toward staying in the territory rather than continuing to California. The landscape grew more rugged as they traveled, the train climbing into the Black Hills proper. The tracks wound through steep-sided valleys, past rushing streams and stands of ponderosa pine. It was beautiful country, wild and untamed, and Sarah found herself imagining what it would be like to live here, to call this place home. By midday, the train made a brief stop at a small station where passengers could purchase food from vendors. Sarah used one of her precious dollars to buy bread and cheese, eating it mechanically while watching for Jude. She spotted him watering his horse at a trough near the freight building, and without thinking, she disembarked and walked over to him. "You should take a break," she said as she approached. "You have been riding hard all morning." Jude looked up from adjusting his saddle, and that almost smile appeared again. "I am fine. This is easy compared to moving cattle across open range." "Have you eaten?" Sarah asked, and when he did not answer immediately, she held out the bread and cheese she had bought. "Here. I cannot eat all of this, and it will just go to waste otherwise." It was a transparent lie, and they both knew it, but Jude accepted the food with a quiet thank you that made Sarah's chest warm. They stood together in the shade of a cottonwood tree, sharing the simple meal, and Sarah was struck by how comfortable it felt, how natural, despite the unusual circumstances. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said after a moment. "Of course." "Your ranch, the one Daniel left you, what is it like?" Jude's expression softened, the way it always did when he spoke about the ranch. "It is about 500 acres, mostly grazing land but with some good timber along the creek. The house is small, just 3 rooms, but it is solid, built from local stone. There is a barn and the foreman's cabin I mentioned, plus a few other outbuildings. I run about 200 head of cattle, along with a small herd of horses that I am trying to build into something profitable." "It sounds lovely," Sarah said honestly. "It is home," Jude replied simply. "I never thought I would have a place I could call that, and now I do. Daniel gave me that." He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "The house needs work. I am decent with repairs, but there are things that need a woman's touch, curtains and such, and the bookkeeping is a disaster. I can barely keep track of my expenses, much less figure out if I am making a profit. That part of ranch management just does not come naturally to me." "I am good with numbers," Sarah said before she could stop herself. "My father was a clerk, and he taught me bookkeeping when I was young. I used to help him with his ledgers." "See," Jude's smile widened slightly, "you would be perfect for the job." The conductor called the 5-minute warning, and Sarah reluctantly stood. "I should get back on the train." "I will be riding alongside," Jude reminded her. "If you need anything, just wave from the window, and I will find a way to signal the conductor to stop." Sarah doubted that was actually possible, but she appreciated the sentiment. She returned to her seat on the train, and as they pulled out of the station, she watched Jude remount and fall into position alongside the tracks again. The afternoon stretched long and hot as they crossed into Wyoming territory. The landscape changed again, becoming more arid, with sagebrush replacing pine trees. Sarah dozed fitfully, the rocking of the train and the heat making it difficult to stay awake. When she opened her eyes in late afternoon, she immediately looked out the window, searching for Jude. He was there, as he had been all day, though she could see the toll the long ride was taking. His horse moved more slowly now, and Jude sat with the slightly slumped posture of someone who had been in the saddle too long. But when he noticed her watching, he straightened and touched his hat brim in greeting. Sarah's heart twisted. He was exhausting himself for her, pushing both himself and his horse to their limits just to keep his promise. No one had ever done anything like that for her before, had ever treated her safety and well-being as if it mattered that much. The train pulled into a small town called Newcastle as the sun began to set, and the conductor announced that this would be a longer stop, about 2 hours, to take on water and coal. Sarah gathered her carpet bag and stepped off the train, needing to stretch her legs and find Jude. She found him near the livery stable, negotiating with the hostler to get his horse properly fed and watered. The animal looked tired but sound, and Jude ran his hands over its legs with the practiced touch of someone who knew horses well. "You are going to kill that poor horse," Sarah said as she approached. Jude looked up, and in the golden light of sunset she could see fatigue etched in his face. "He is fine. I have been pacing him, giving him breaks when the terrain allowed. And what about you? When do you get a break?" "I am fine too," Jude said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah made a decision. "There is a restaurant across from the station. You are going to come have dinner with me, and you are going to eat a proper meal, and you are not going to argue." Jude blinked, clearly surprised by her tone. "Yes, madam," he said, and there was genuine amusement in his voice now. They walked together to the restaurant, a modest establishment with checkered tablecloths and the smell of roasting meat. The proprietor, a stout woman with flour on her apron, seated them at a corner table and promised that the beef stew was the best in Wyoming territory. As they waited for their food, Sarah studied Jude in the lamplight. Dust coated his clothes and face, and she could see the weariness in the set of his shoulders. But his eyes were alert when they met hers, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. "You did not have to do this," he said quietly. "Buy me dinner, I mean." "You have done far more for me," Sarah replied. "This is the least I can do. I told you I am not keeping a tally. I do not expect repayment." "I know." Sarah folded her hands on the table, gathering her courage. "Jude, I have been thinking about your offer, about the job on your ranch." She saw him tense, saw hope and fear war in his expression. "And I have questions, practical questions if you do not mind answering them. Of course, ask anything." Sarah took a breath. "The foreman's cabin you mentioned, is it livable right now or would it need repairs?" "It is livable," Jude said. "A little dusty from not being used, but the roof is sound, and it has a working stove and a decent bed. I would make sure it was properly cleaned and stocked with supplies before you moved in. And this woman you mentioned hiring as a chaperone. Do you have someone specific in mind?" "There is a widow in Hill City, Mrs. Clara Murphy. She does laundry and cooking for several ranchers in the area. She is respectable, a member of the church, and I know she could use the extra income. I would pay her to come by 3 times a week, help with the housework, and serve as a chaperone any time you needed to be in the main house." Sarah nodded slowly. "What would my duties be exactly?" "Cooking, cleaning, bookkeeping like I mentioned. Maybe some sewing and mending if you know how." "I am terrible at repairing clothes." He paused. "Honestly, Sarah, the work would not be that different from what you would do in any household, but you would be paid for it and you would have independence. Your own space, your own money, the ability to make your own decisions." "How much would you pay?" Sarah asked, feeling mercenary but needing to know. Jude named a monthly sum that made Sarah's eyes widen. It was more than she would have expected, more than fair wages for the work he had described. "That seems like a lot," she said carefully. "It is what the work is worth," Jude replied firmly. "And it is what I can afford to pay. The ranch does well enough, Sarah. I am not rich, but I am not struggling either. Daniel left me with good stock and good land, and I have worked hard to build on that. I can pay you fairly and still keep the ranch running." The food arrived, interrupting their conversation. Sarah dug into the stew, which was indeed as good as promised, and for a few minutes they both ate in silence. But Sarah's mind was churning, weighing options, considering possibilities. "If I did take the job," she said slowly, "it would not be permanent, would it? I mean, if things did not work out, or if I decided I wanted to try California after all, I would be free to leave." "Of course," Jude said immediately. "I am not trying to trap you, Sarah. This is about giving you options, not taking them away. If you worked for 6 months and decided it was not right for you, you could leave with my blessing and however much money you had saved from your wages." Sarah set down her spoon and looked at him directly. "Why does it matter so much to you? Be honest." Jude was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "Because I see something in you that reminds me of what I lost. Not in a bad way," he added quickly. "I mean, you have this core of strength, this determination to keep going even when everything has fallen apart. That is what I had to find in myself 5 years ago, and I almost did not make it. If Daniel had not stepped in, I do not know where I would have ended up. Probably dead in some back alley, or in prison, or just broken in a way that could never be fixed." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "When I see you fighting to survive, to build something from nothing, I want to help the way Daniel helped me. But it is more than that." He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "You are not broken, Sarah. You have been through hell, I can see that, but you have not let it break you. And I think if you had a fair chance, if you had some stability and support, you could build an incredible life. I want to be part of making that possible." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Jude said simply. "Sometimes you just recognize something in a person, some quality that resonates. I recognized it in you the moment I saw you on that platform." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and as they walked back toward the station, Sarah felt the weight of her decision pressing on her. San Francisco meant safety, meant family of a sort, but it also meant dependence and uncertainty. The ranch meant independence, meaningful work, and the chance to build something of her own, and it meant Jude. She could not ignore that factor, much as her sensible side insisted she should. There was something between them, some connection that had formed impossibly fast. She did not know if it was just gratitude on her part, or loneliness, or something deeper and more real. But she knew that walking away from him, continuing on to California and never seeing him again, would hurt in a way that seemed out of proportion to their brief acquaintance. At the station, as passengers began boarding for the next leg of the journey, Sarah made her decision. "I will stay," she said, the words coming out barely above a whisper. "I will take the job, try working on your ranch. If it does not work out, I can always go to my aunt later, but I want to try this first." The transformation in Jude's face was remarkable. Relief and joy washed over his features, making him look younger, less weathered. "You mean it?" "I mean it," Sarah confirmed, and saying it out loud made it feel real, made the decision settle into certainty in her chest. "I do not know if this is the wise choice or the foolish one, but it feels right. So yes, I will stay." Jude's hand moved as if he wanted to reach for hers, but he stopped himself, maintaining propriety. "You will not regret this, Sarah. I promise you that. I will make sure you have everything you need to succeed." "I know," Sarah said, and she did know. Whatever else was uncertain about this decision, she trusted Jude's word completely. They stood on the platform as the train prepared to depart without her, and Sarah felt a strange, giddy sensation, like jumping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. She was not going to California. She was staying in Wyoming territory with a cowboy she had known for 2 days, taking a job on a ranch she had never seen. It was reckless and probably foolish, and she did not care at all. "We should head back toward Hill City," Jude said, his voice energized despite his earlier fatigue. "My ranch is about 20 miles southwest of town. We can make it there by tomorrow evening if we start early." "How will we travel?" Sarah asked, suddenly practical. "I cannot ride your horse with you all that way. There is a livery here that sells horses and wagons. I have enough money to buy a good mare for you, something gentle and reliable. Or if you prefer, I can buy a small wagon, though that would take longer." "I can ride," Sarah said. She had not been on a horse since she was a child, but she remembered the basics, and the idea of having her own mount appealed to her sense of independence. A horse would be fine. Jude's smile widened. "All right then. We will find you a good horse in the morning, and we will head out after breakfast." They spent the night in Newcastle, Jude insisting on paying for Sarah to have a room at the local boarding house while he once again camped outside of town. Sarah tried to protest, but he was firm and she eventually gave in. Too tired to argue, alone in her room, Sarah sat on the bed and tried to process what she had just done. She had abandoned her plan to reach her aunt, had committed to working for a man she barely knew, had chosen to stay in a wild and often dangerous territory instead of traveling to the relative civilization of San Francisco. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt excited, energized in a way she had not felt since before her father's death. This was her choice, her decision, made freely without pressure or coercion. Whatever happened next, she would face it on her own terms. Morning came, and with it, a sense of purpose that carried Sarah through the next few hours. Jude arrived at the boarding house just after dawn, looking considerably more rested than he had the night before. They ate breakfast together, then walked to the livery stable where Jude had left his horse. The liveryman, a weathered older gentleman with a pronounced limp, showed them several horses that might be suitable for Sarah. She ended up choosing a dappled gray mare with kind eyes and a gentle temperament. The mare was 8 years old, the liveryman explained, broke to both saddle and harness and reliable on the trail. Jude paid the price without haggling, then purchased a saddle and bridle designed for a woman's use. As Sarah watched him count out bills, she felt a pang of guilt at how much money he was spending on her behalf. "I will pay you back," she said as they led the mare out of the stable. "Once I start earning wages, I will pay you back for the horse and the saddle. The horse is yours, Sarah. Consider it a hiring bonus." "That is too generous. It is practical," Jude interrupted gently. "You will need a horse to get around the ranch to ride into town when you need supplies. This is not charity, it is common sense." Sarah wanted to argue further, but the mare chose that moment to nuzzle her shoulder, and she found herself smiling despite her concerns. "What is her name?" Liveryman called her Daisy, Jude said, "but you can change it if you want." "Daisy is perfect," Sarah said, stroking the mare's soft nose. They set out within the hour, riding side by side as Newcastle disappeared behind them. The landscape stretched vast and open, rolling grassland dotted with sagebrush, the Black Hills visible as a dark smudge on the eastern horizon. The sky was huge and cloudless, the blue so intense it almost hurt to look at. Sarah found her seat on the horse quickly, muscle memory returning along with a sense of freedom she had not anticipated. There was something exhilarating about riding across open country, about feeling the power of the horse beneath her and the wind in her face. Jude set an easy pace, clearly mindful of Sarah's inexperience and the fact that they had all day to cover the distance. They stopped frequently to rest the horses and to allow Sarah to stretch her legs, which began protesting the unaccustomed exercise by mid-morning. As they rode, Jude talked about the ranch, painting a picture of her new home with words. He described the creek that ran through the property, cold and clear even in the hottest months. He talked about the cattle, explaining his plans to improve the herd over the next few years. He mentioned the challenges of ranching, the constant battle with weather and predators, and the simple hard work of maintaining fences and buildings. "I am not trying to scare you off," he said at one point, when he noticed Sarah's expression growing concerned. "I just want you to know what you are getting into. It is a good life, but it is not an easy one." "I have never been afraid of hard work," Sarah replied. "My father was not a wealthy man. I know what it means to struggle." "I believe you," Jude said, and his tone suggested he truly did. They made camp that night beside a creek, Jude expertly building a fire and cooking beans and bacon in a skillet. Sarah helped as much as she could, though she felt clumsy and useless compared to his practiced efficiency. They ate as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Sarah thought she had never seen anything more beautiful. "My father would have loved this," she said softly, almost to herself. "He always talked about coming west, seeing the mountains and the wide open spaces. But he never had the chance." "Tell me about him," Jude said, settling back against his saddle so Sarah did. She talked about her father, about his quiet strength and his love of books, about how he had worked as a clerk in Boston for 20 years before deciding to try his luck in the Dakota Territory. She talked about how he had gotten sick just 6 weeks after they arrived in Hill City, how the fever had taken him so fast that she barely had time to process what was happening. "He had saved money for my ticket to San Francisco," Sarah said, her voice thickening with emotion. "He knew his sister would take me in, that she would give me a chance at a good life. And then that station master stole it, just took my father's hard-earned money and lied about it, and there was nothing I could do." "There is plenty you could have done," Jude said quietly. "But all of it would have required time and resources you did not have. That is how men like that station master operate. They prey on people who cannot afford to fight back." "It makes me so angry," Sarah admitted. "Not just for myself, but for everyone he has cheated." "You said you had seen him do it to others," Jude nodded. 3 times that I know of, probably more that I did not witness. I reported him to the railroad company once, but nothing came of it. He has friends in the right places, apparently." They were quiet for a moment, and then Sarah said, "Thank you for standing up to him. Even if I end up regretting this decision, even if working on your ranch turns out to be a disaster, at least I did not let him win completely." "You will not regret it," Jude said with such certainty that Sarah almost believed him. "And working on the ranch will not be a disaster. I will make sure of that. You seem very confident." "I am confident in you," Jude replied, meeting her eyes across the fire. "I have seen how you carry yourself, how you keep going even when everything is falling apart. That takes strength, Sarah. Real strength, the kind that cannot be faked. You are going to do well on the ranch. I know it." Sarah felt heat in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. The way Jude looked at her, the conviction in his voice, made her feel seen in a way she had not experienced before. Not as a burden or a problem to be solved, but as a person with value and potential. "I hope you are right," she said softly. They slept on opposite sides of the fire that night, propriety maintained even in the wilderness. Sarah lay in her bedroll looking up at more stars than she had known existed, and she thought about how much her life had changed in just 3 days. She had gone from desperate and alone to employed and traveling with a man who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being. It felt surreal, like something from one of the novels her father used to read aloud on winter evenings. But it was real. The hard ground beneath her was real. The sound of the creek and the horses shifting in their hobbles was real. And Jude's quiet breathing from the other side of the fire was very, very real. They reached the ranch late the following afternoon, and Sarah got her first look at what would be her new home. Jude had not exaggerated. The house was small but solid, built from local stone with a wooden roof. The barn was larger, well-maintained, with a corral attached where several horses watched their approach with interest. Beyond the main buildings, Sarah could see the foreman's cabin Jude had mentioned, a smaller structure set back among a stand of cottonwood trees. "What do you think?" Jude asked, and Sarah could hear nervous anticipation in his voice. "It is beautiful," Sarah said honestly. The ranch sat in a valley with the creek running through it, grass growing thick and green along the banks. Hills rose on all sides, providing shelter from the wind. It looked peaceful, prosperous in a modest way, exactly the kind of place she could imagine building a life. Jude visibly relaxed. "Let me show you the cabin, make sure it is suitable." They rode to the smaller building, and Jude helped Sarah dismount, his hands strong and steady on her waist. The brief contact made her pulse jump, and from the way Jude's eyes widened slightly, she thought maybe he felt it too. The cabin was indeed dusty, but as Jude had promised, it was structurally sound. One large room served as both living space and bedroom, with a small kitchen area against one wall and a separate room that appeared to be a washroom of sorts. The bed was narrow but looked comfortable, and there was a small table with 2 chairs, a dresser, and even a rocking chair by the window. "I will have Mrs. Murphy come tomorrow to help clean it properly," Jude said, hovering near the door as if unsure whether he should enter. "And I will make sure you have fresh linens and supplies, everything you need to be comfortable." "It is perfect," Sarah said, and she meant it. The cabin was small, but it was hers, her own space where she could close the door and have privacy. After weeks of being dependent on others' charity, of sleeping in boarding house rooms or on a train, having a place of her own felt like an unimaginable luxury. Jude showed her the main house next, apologizing in advance for its condition. He had not exaggerated about needing help. The place was functional but cluttered, with dishes stacked in the sink, papers scattered across the table, and dust coating every surface. But beneath the mess, Sarah could see good bones, a home that just needed care and attention. "I know it is bad," Jude said, looking embarrassed. "I have been focused on the ranch work, on the animals and the fences and the endless list of things that need doing outside. The house has suffered for it. It is nothing that cannot be fixed," Sarah assured him. "Give me a week, and you will not recognize the place." Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into work with an energy born of relief and purpose. Mrs. Murphy arrived as promised, a brisk, practical woman in her 50s who took one look at Sarah and seemed to approve of what she saw. Together, they cleaned the cabin until it shone, then moved on to the main house, tackling years of accumulated bachelor neglect. Jude was absent during most of the daylight hours, working cattle or riding fence lines, or doing the 1,000 other tasks that kept a ranch running. But he appeared for meals, which Sarah cooked with increasing confidence, and in the evenings they would sit on the porch of the main house, talking as the sun set. Sarah learned more about Jude during those conversations. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 3 brothers. His family had lost their farm when he was 19, his parents dead of illness within 6 months of each other. His older brothers had gone east looking for work, and Jude had heard nothing from them in years. He had drifted west, taking odd jobs, getting into trouble until Daniel Nelson had found him and given him a second chance. "You miss your brothers?" Sarah asked one evening. Jude considered the question. "Sometimes, but we were never close, not the way family should be. They always saw me as a burden, the extra mouth to feed. When our parents died, they made it clear I was on my own. So I guess I do not miss them so much as I miss the idea of having family, people you can count on." "I understand that," Sarah said softly. "My mother died when I was 16, and after that, it was just my father and me. We were close, but it was also lonely sometimes. I used to dream about having siblings, about having a house full of people and noise and life." "Maybe you will have that someday," Jude said, and something in his tone made Sarah look at him sharply, but his expression was unreadable in the gathering darkness. The days turned into weeks, and Sarah fell into a rhythm at the ranch. She rose early to prepare breakfast, spent the mornings cleaning and doing laundry, the afternoons working on the bookkeeping that Jude had warned her about. He had not exaggerated there either. His records were a mess, barely legible notes scattered across multiple ledgers with no apparent system. Sarah organized everything methodically, creating a new ledger with clear columns for income and expenses. She tracked the costs of feed and supplies, recorded the sales of cattle, and within 2 weeks, she was able to show Jude a clear picture of the ranch's financial situation. "We are doing better than I thought," Jude said, studying the neat rows of figures with something like awe. "I always felt like I was just barely keeping ahead, but according to this, we have a decent profit margin." "You have a good profit margin," Sarah corrected. "You are just terrible at tracking it, but the ranch itself is sound, Jude. You have done well." The pride in his face made something warm bloom in Sarah's chest. She realized with a start that making Jude happy had become important to her, that she looked forward to these moments when she could show him her work and see his appreciation. It was more than gratitude. She was forced to admit to herself, late one night as she lay in her bed in the cabin. Somewhere over the past month, her feelings for Jude had shifted from thankfulness into something deeper and more complicated. She found herself watching for him during the day, listening for the sound of his horse. She noticed things about him: the way he pushed his hair back when he was thinking, the careful way he cleaned his gun each evening, the rough gentleness of his hands when he worked with the horses. And sometimes, she caught him watching her with an expression that made her heart race, something intense and yearning that he quickly shuddered when he realized she had noticed. Mrs. Murphy, who was nobody's fool, commented on it one afternoon as she and Sarah worked on mending clothes. "You and Jude, you are dancing around each other like two people afraid to hear the music," the older woman said bluntly. Sarah felt heat flood her face. "I do not know what you mean." "Oh, I think you do. That man looks at you like you hung the moon, dear. And unless I am very much mistaken, you look at him the same way." "It would not be appropriate," Sarah said, trying to sound firm. "I work for him." "There is a power imbalance." "Nonsense," Mrs. Murphy interrupted. "You are both adults, both free to make your own choices. And from what I can see, you make each other happy. Life is too short and too hard to ignore that when you find it." "But what if it does not work out?" Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her mind. "What if we try being more than employer and employee and it fails?" "Then I would have to leave, give up the life I am building here." "And what if it does work out?" Mrs. Murphy countered. "What if you are passing up something wonderful because you are too afraid to take a risk?" "You have already taken the biggest risk by staying here, by trusting Jude enough to accept his help. Do not stop now just because you are scared." Sarah thought about that conversation for days afterward. She knew Mrs. Murphy was right, knew that what she felt for Jude was more than just gratitude or friendship. But the thought of risking what she had, the stability and security she had found on the ranch, terrified her. The decision was taken out of her hands one afternoon in early October, 2 months after she had arrived at the ranch. Sarah was in the barn, gathering eggs from the chickens they had recently purchased, when she heard hoofbeats approaching fast. She emerged to find Jude riding in at a gallop, his face set in grim lines. "What is wrong?" Sarah asked, immediately alarmed. Jude dismounted in one fluid motion. "Cattle thieves. I found evidence up in the north pasture, at least 20 head missing, maybe more. I need to ride to town, report it to the sheriff, and then see if I can track them." "Is it dangerous?" Sarah heard the fear in her own voice and did not try to hide it. "Could be." Jude's expression softened as he looked at her. "I will be careful, Sarah, I promise. But I needed to come back, tell you what was happening so you would not worry if I was not back by nightfall." "How long will you be gone?" "Could be a few days, depending on what the sheriff decides to do and whether we can pick up the trail." He paused, then stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Sarah, I need to tell you something before I go, just in case." "Do not," Sarah interrupted, her heart pounding. "Do not say just in case. You are coming back." "I am coming back," Jude agreed. "But I still need to say this. These past 2 months having you here, it has been the best time I can remember since Daniel died. You have made this place feel like a real home, not just a house I live in. And it is not just about the clean floors or the organized books, though those are wonderful. It is you, Sarah. Your presence, your smile, the way you laugh at my terrible jokes. I look forward to seeing you every morning, and I dread riding out because it means being away from you." Sarah's breath caught. "Jude, I am in love with you," he said simply, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I started falling the moment I saw you on that platform in Hill City, and I have not stopped since. I know it is too soon. I know I should have waited, been more patient. But if something happens out there, if those thieves decide to fight instead of run, I need you to know how I feel." Sarah stared at him, her mind reeling. "You love me." "I love you," Jude confirmed. "And I am not expecting you to say it back, not if you do not feel the same. I just needed you to know." All of Sarah's careful reservations, all her fears about power imbalances and propriety and the risk of losing what she had built, evaporated in the face of the truth she had been avoiding. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and placed her hand on Jude's chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palm. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I have been trying not to, trying to be sensible and practical, but I cannot help it. I love you, Jude Norton, and you had better come back safe, because I have no intention of losing you now that I have found you." The kiss that followed was inevitable, a collision of two people who had been holding themselves back for too long. Jude's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Sarah melted into him, into the warmth and strength and rightness of being held by someone who loved her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jude rested his forehead against hers. "I will come back," he promised. "Nothing is going to keep me from you, Sarah. Not thieves, not danger, nothing." "I am going to hold you to that," Sarah said, trying to sound stern despite the tears on her cheeks. Jude kissed her once more, quick and fierce, then pulled away and mounted his horse. Sarah watched him ride away, her hand pressed to her lips, her heart a chaotic mix of joy and fear. He was gone for 3 days, and they were the longest 3 days of Sarah's life. She threw herself into work, cleaning things that were already clean, organizing things that were already organized, anything to keep her mind occupied. Mrs. Murphy came by as usual and immediately saw that something had changed. "He told you how he feels, did he not?" the older woman said. Sarah nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. And you told him the truth, too? Another nod. Mrs. Murphy pulled Sarah into a warm hug. Then have faith, dear. Jude Norton is a survivor. He will come back to you. On the evening of the third day, Sarah was standing on the porch of the main house, watching the sun set when she saw a rider approaching. Her heart leaped, and she ran to meet him, not caring about dignity or propriety. Jude dismounted and caught her as she launched herself at him, his arms strong and sure around her waist. "I am all right," he said into her hair. "I am all right, Sarah. We got the cattle back, caught 2 of the thieves. The others scattered, but the sheriff thinks they will leave the area now that they know we are watching." "You are sure you are not hurt?" Sarah pulled back, her hands running over his chest and arms, checking for injuries. "Not a scratch," Jude assured her. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears she had not realized she was crying. "I told you I would come back to you." "I know, but I was still so scared." He kissed her, silencing her worries, and Sarah kissed him back with all the fear and relief and love she had been carrying for 3 days. When they finally separated, Jude kept his arms around her, as if he could not bear to let her go. "Marry me," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other for 2 months, but I do not care. I love you, Sarah, and I want you to be my wife, not my employee. I want to fall asleep beside you every night and wake up with you every morning. I want to build a life with you, a real life, a family. Marry me." Sarah felt joy explode in her chest, so intense it was almost painful. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, of course I will marry you, you foolish man. Did you think I would say no?" "I hope not," Jude admitted, grinning now. "But I had to ask." They married a week later in the small church in Hill City, with Mrs. Murphy and the sheriff as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Murphy had helped her sew, and Jude wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair slicked back in a way that made Sarah want to run her fingers through it and muss it up again. The ceremony was brief, the minister's words formal, but when Jude slipped a simple gold band on Sarah's finger and kissed her as his wife, Sarah felt as if her whole world had shifted into perfect alignment. This was right. This was what she was meant to be doing, where she was meant to be. They held a small celebration at the ranch afterward, Mrs. Murphy having somehow rallied several of the neighboring ranchers and their wives to attend. There was food and music and dancing, and Sarah found herself laughing more than she had laughed in months, maybe years. As the sun set and the guests began to depart, Jude pulled Sarah aside away from the crowd, and they walked hand in hand down to the creek. The water burbled over stones, reflecting the last light of day, and Sarah thought she had never been happier. "I never imagined this," she said softly. "When I was standing on that platform in Hill City, when the station master rejected my ticket, I thought my life was over. And now look at me. I am married to a wonderful man, I have a home, I have purpose. It is more than I ever dared to hope for." "Your journey started with me," Jude said, echoing the words he had spoken that first day. "But where it goes from here, that is up to us together." "Together," Sarah agreed, and the word had never sounded sweeter. The first year of their marriage was not without challenges. The ranch demanded constant attention, and there were times when money was tight, when the weather turned bad, when Sarah questioned whether they would make it through. But through it all, Jude was there, steady and strong and unfailingly optimistic. And Sarah found her own strength growing, found that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. She learned to shoot, to defend the ranch when Jude was away. She learned to help with the cattle, to ride fence lines and check on the herd. She expanded her bookkeeping to include projections and planning, helping Jude make strategic decisions about when to sell stock and when to hold back for breeding. And at night, in the privacy of their bedroom in the main house, they learned each other in ways that made Sarah blush to remember in daylight. Jude was a tender lover, patient and attentive, making sure Sarah's pleasure matched his own. He made her feel cherished, desired, loved in a way that healed wounds she had not even known she carried. A year and a half after their wedding, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. She told Jude one evening after dinner, simply and directly, and watched his face transform with wonder and joy. "A baby," he said, his voice awed. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Sarah asked, suddenly nervous. "Happy," Jude laughed and swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests. "Sarah, I am more than happy. I am amazed. I am grateful. I am terrified," he admitted. "But mostly, I am just so full of love I do not know what to do with it all." Their son was born in the spring of 1885, arriving in the middle of a rainstorm with Mrs. Murphy attending as midwife. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Sarah thought she might not survive it. But Jude stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, talking her through the worst of it, and when the baby finally arrived, red-faced and screaming, Sarah thought her heart might burst with love. "What should we name him?" Jude asked, cradling the tiny bundle with a mixture of pride and terror. "Joseph," Sarah said without hesitation. "Joseph Daniel Norton, after my father and the man who saved your life." Jude's eyes grew bright with tears. "It is perfect. He is perfect. You are perfect." Joseph was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Emma, and then another son, Michael, 2 years after that. The house that had seemed too big for just Jude became filled with the noise and chaos of children, exactly the kind of life Sarah had dreamed of when she was young. The ranch prospered. Jude's careful management and Sarah's financial planning paid off, allowing them to expand the herd, purchase more land, build a larger barn. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the work, young men who reminded Jude of himself at that age, and he treated them with the same fairness and respect that Daniel had shown him. Sarah occasionally thought about her aunt in San Francisco, about the life she might have had if she had gotten on that train. She wrote letters sometimes, updating her aunt on her circumstances, and received cordial responses. But she never regretted her choice to stay, never wondered if she had made a mistake. This was her life, the life she had built with Jude, and it was more than she had ever dared to dream. When Joseph was 10 years old enough to understand, Sarah told him the story of how she and Jude had met. They were sitting on the porch on a summer evening, watching Joseph and his siblings play in the yard, and Sarah felt the weight of memory press on her. "Your father saved my life," she said simply. "I was at the lowest point I had ever been, completely alone and desperate, and he appeared like an answer to a prayer I had not even known how to pray. He bought me a train ticket and told me that my journey started with him, and he was right." "But you did not get on the train," Joseph said, his young face serious. "No, I did not. Because somewhere along the way I realized that my journey was not about reaching a destination. It was about finding a home and a family and a purpose, and I found all of that with your father." Jude, who had been listening quietly, reached over and took Sarah's hand. "We found it together," he corrected gently. "You saved me as much as I saved you, Sarah. You gave me a reason to build something beyond just a successful ranch. You gave me a family, a real home, love. You gave me everything that matters." Sarah leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his shoulder beneath her cheek, and watched her children play in the fading light. This was her journey, the one that had started on a train platform in Hill City, with a rejected ticket and a stranger's kindness. It had led her through fear and uncertainty, through hard work and harder choices, and ultimately to this moment, this perfect, ordinary evening surrounded by the people she loved most. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growing children. Joseph grew tall and strong, learning ranching from his father with an aptitude that made Jude proud. Emma developed a love for horses that rivaled Jude's own, spending hours in the barn caring for the animals. Michael was the scholar of the family, always reading, always asking questions about the world beyond their ranch. Sarah and Jude grew older together, their faces weathering like the land they worked, their bodies bearing the marks of hard living and harder work. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened over the years, becoming something so fundamental to their existence that Sarah could not imagine life without it. When their children were grown and starting families of their own, when grandchildren began appearing with delightful regularity, Sarah and Jude would sit on the porch in the evenings and talk about the years they had shared. "You remember that first day?" Sarah asked one evening, the question more ritual than genuine inquiry. They had told the story so many times, to children and grandchildren and curious neighbors, that it had taken on the quality of legend. "I remember everything," Jude said, his voice still strong despite the gray in his hair and beard. "I remember seeing you on that platform, looking like your world had ended. I remember thinking that I had to help, that I would regret it for the rest of my life if I did not." "Best decision you ever made," Sarah teased, and Jude laughed. "Second best," he corrected. "The best decision was convincing you to stay, to give us a chance." "I do not think it took much convincing," Sarah admitted. "I think I was already half in love with you by the time we reached Newcastle. I just was not ready to admit it yet." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, they could see Joseph working with the cattle, could hear Emma's laughter as she played with her children in the yard. The ranch was thriving, passed down now to the next generation, but still bearing the marks of everything Sarah and Jude had built together. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you had gone to San Francisco?" Jude asked, a question he had never posed before. Sarah considered it seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but only in an abstract way, like wondering about a book I never read. This life, the one we built together, this is the only life that feels real to me. The rest is just possibility, and I have never been one to dwell on what might have been when what is makes me so happy." Jude squeezed her hand, his grip still strong. "I love you, Sarah Norton. I loved you the moment I saw you, and I will love you until the day I die, and probably beyond that too." "Good," Sarah said, her eyes bright with tears and laughter. "Because you are stuck with me, Jude Norton, for better or worse, as long as we both shall live." They were words from their wedding vows, spoken more than 30 years earlier, but they still carried weight, still meant something profound. They sat together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and the stars began to emerge, two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment, who had built something lasting from a chance encounter and a single act of kindness. Sarah's journey had indeed started with Jude on that train platform in Hill City, but it had become so much more than either of them could have imagined, a story of love and resilience, and the power of choosing to take a risk on another person. It was a story they would tell and retell for the rest of their lives, a story their children and grandchildren would carry forward, a story that proved that sometimes the best journeys are the ones that take you somewhere completely unexpected. As they finally rose to go inside, to the home they had built and filled with life and love, Sarah looked back at the land spread out before them in the darkness. This was where she belonged, where she had always been meant to be. Her journey had started with Jude, but it had led her home. The end.